FutureSense is a podcast edited from the radio show of the same name, broadcast on Bay FM in Byron Bay, Australia at bayfm.org. Hosted by Nyck Jeanes and well-known international futurist Steve McDonald, FutureSense provides a fresh, deep analysis of global trends and emergent technologies. How can we identify the layers of growth, personally, socially, and globally? What are the signs missed, the truths being denied? Science, history, politics, psychology, ancient civilizations, alien contact, the new psychedelic revolution, cryptocurrency and other disruptive and distributed technologies, and much more. This is FutureSense. And thanks to Brett for another bongo gum. He'll be back tomorrow morning, 6 to 9, Monday and Tuesdays here on Bay FM 999. You're now tuned to FutureSense. With myself, Nyck Jeanes, and Steve McDonald. You are with us here on Bay FM. Hopefully you've had your morning coffee or whatever your poison of choice is. I note that coffee was so important in Turkish culture that under 15th century law, a woman had the freedom to divorce her husband if he did not provide her with enough coffee. How do you think about that? Unfortunately, my girlfriend doesn't drink coffee, so I've just got to provide myself with enough coffee. But I think that's a wonderful thing. Women had the freedom to divorce a husband if he didn't provide her with enough coffee.
I guess. Or maybe the wrong coffee. Perhaps she prefers a long black, for example.
Like I do. You prefer latte with sugar. I prefer it straight up. An undiluted, unpolluted cup of black, dark, thick herb. It's got nothing to do with what we're going to be talking about today, though.
Not at all.
Coffee.
Not
but
at
I
all.
thought I'd throw that in because I came across, I thought it was a wonderful little piece that...
Yeah, I think I saw that on a cafe wall somewhere.
No doubt. In Melbourne, probably. Steve McDonald, good morning to you. How are you doing?
Good morning, Nick. I'm well.
Lovely to see you again, as always.
Always.
It's always beautiful to see you. As much as one can see anybody. In fact, that's in some slanted way, which is my way, it's sort of about how we are talking today, about how we see each other. I guess in one sense, we are all so different at this time.
We are indeed. We kind of always talk about this in some way, don't we?
Yeah, we do.
Yeah.
Now, we're going to be talking a lot about climate change today, not exclusively, but we're going to probably begin with that this morning, in particularly regards to how different layers of evolution, of development in terms of Graves's model that we refer to all the time, how people seem to or do respond to the climate change debate, to climate science and the like. And start from there. We've had, I'll come back to this for now, but we've had a couple of communications this week regarding some of the things we've been speaking about on this particular topic, and we'll refer to those a little bit and hopefully bring a few more answers and expand that debate, so to speak, a little bit, if you will. You're tuned to FutureSense with Nyck Jeanes and Steve McDonald. Engage, emerge, activate, and spiral up. Also, should mention too, and thanks to our good friend, compatriot, and occasional guest on the show, Ross Hill, who has been helping us and doing a lot of work setting up the FutureSense podcast, which is available on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. You can subscribe; they're free, and you can also follow us on Twitter at FutureSense Show.
It's not stuttering, folks.
I do stutter a bit occasionally when I don't know what I'm talking about, which is quite often, really. Just trying to make up something.
Now that I know that.
You know that. You already know that, my friend. Now, we've had a couple of... well, first of all, let's look at this. At the moment, you'd be aware that 2018, last year, was, I think, the third hottest year in Australian history, in recorded history. And at the moment, of course, we're in another bit of a heat wave across the country this week. And meanwhile, across Europe, we've got incredible amounts of cold happening, avalanches hitting Swiss hotels, 21 or more people dead in Europe, extreme Arctic snow, minus 33 degrees temperatures.
Yeah, I heard on the radio this morning an Australian was killed in an avalanche.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've also got in Whistler in America. We've just recently had the coldest Thanksgiving in US history, in US recorded history. In November last year, Greece record plummets to a record minus 23 degrees centigrade as European cold snap sees enormous dumping of snow. And apparently there's more coming. So you've got these incredible polarities between the expressions of weather on the planet at the moment. Number one, so clearly we're in a stage of climate disruption.
We are certainly, and we know that complex adaptive systems become chaotic when they go through major change, and it looks like that's what we're seeing here.
Yeah. Now, we've had a couple of communications from listeners to this show, and thanks to those who have taken a bit of a look, and even, if I may put it gently, a swipe at us for some of the things we've been talking about with the idea of a possible mini ice age and the cooling of the planet rather than the heating of the planet. And I want to preface this immediately by what we've often claimed on here, and this has got nothing to do with the coal industry, the coal and all fossil fuel industry, which we totally support the swift demise of and the replacement with with new renewable, sustainable technology. So it actually has nothing to do with that debate. That's sort of that you could argue possibly is a closed debate. We do need to shift from those fuel sources. However, climate change itself is, as you said, a complex adaptive system, the climate on this planet. And the response to it is different depending on where you are and who you are and what information you take in and give weight to and the like.
That's right, yeah. I mean, to just talk about complex adaptive systems on their own for a short moment. Natural systems are complex adaptive systems in that they are open to receiving information from their environment, their surrounds, and they are able to adapt to those changes through internal changes to their own operation.
Yeah.
And
that's not a linear process, is it?
It's not a linear process. Yeah. It's a cyclic process, yeah. and even it's even spiraling. You know, much as we now know that our solar system spirals through our galaxy, it doesn't travel in a straight line. All of these different changes that we talk about, and particularly in complex adaptive systems, are generally cyclic, and each subsequent cycle is never exactly the same. Each subsequent cycle is always different in some way to the previous cycle. So in effect, it's a spiraling movement which has a direction.
Because there's always more information that's coming into the equation, isn't there? Which
that's right. The system itself is never the same from one cycle to the next. Just as we are not the same. You know, as the years tick over, we're not the same person we were last year.
Now, I wouldn't call it a position, but certainly your offering in terms of your own research into this area has proposed on this show, and you strongly state this, which is great, that this complex adaptive system theory, when applied to climate change on this planet, means that the science is not closed. And there is some people who, on the strong sort of global warming, I should point out too, probably you've noticed, folks, that the term global warming is less in use now, and the term climate change is much more in use, and that's pretty sensible for a start, I think, because clearly it's not just warming the planet. But this complex system is, we haven't factored in everything, and that's the point here. Or have we factored in everything, and how do we, and why haven't we factored in all the possible influences on this spiralic, ever-increasing complex system that you're talking about?
Yeah, there's a couple of things to unpack in what you said there. The first one is that often we have to isolate a certain part of a system, or isolate a part, look at a system in isolation from its surroundings in order to be able to study it. You know, it's just too hard to try and study everything at once, obviously. And in isolating a system or regarding a system as being closed, we have to take into account that there are influences we're not looking at when we make those studies. And that's not to say the science isn't useful. It is useful. And we have to break things down, chunk things down in order to comprehend them and study them.
Yes.
But we also need to take into account that when we do that, we are missing part of the picture, because even if you stick something in like a closed glass container in a laboratory so that it's supposedly a closed system, it's still subject to light coming in, it's still subject to human observation. And quantum mechanics shows us that human observation actually has an impact on whatever we're observing.
And I guess as soon as you put anything in a box, you've changed it just because it's in a box for a start. That's also a major maybe a major influence on the quality or what actually is happening to the thing inside the box.
That's right. And for a lot of science, this is not a particularly big issue.
No.
But when we're talking about something as large and as complex as the planet's climate, it is a big issue, particularly because there are many influences to the climate which are extraterrestrial.
Yes.
Like solar activity, space weather, those sorts of things, cosmic radiation. So there's that. And then you've got to look at the human consciousness and ask yourself, okay, who are the people who are doing this examination, and from what layer of human consciousness are they observing? You know, if you think of each layer of human consciousness as like a window onto the world, and a window that has a particular color and flavor and angle to it. And there are changes going on in human consciousness right now that are shifting the way that we do science. And a lot of those changes are the result of a rejection of our old paradigm. So we're talking in very general terms now about the dominant global paradigm being the modern scientific industrial perspective. And we're shifting from that to a very humanistic perspective. And this is reflected in things like the fact that we're starting to call this era the anthropocentric era, right? Because it's human-centered, and we're seeing everything from that human-centered perspective. And so human values, the human experience, the emotions that we feel and express are becoming more important through that particular emerging perspective. And that is changing the way that we do science. And I think we mentioned on the show last week that, you know, one of the examples of that is a lot of media reports we see now are no longer saying, you know, the climate science is in because of this data and that data. They're saying the climate science is in because 97% of scientists agree, right? So they're
once upon a time, 97% of scientists agreed the Earth was flat. I would imagine.
Well, exactly. So it's important that we become aware of our own limitations in the way that we're doing science, in the way that we're considering these things, and just factor in that each perspective has its limits, even our perspective, right? So it's more important than ever to gather different perspectives, and that's a big aspect of how human consciousness is changing at the moment. We're moving from a sort of central viewpoint and looking at multiple options and then choosing the best option to a different way of interacting with the world, which involves moving around to different viewpoints and absorbing and understanding different perspectives on things.
As you said last week, standing in moccasins, that was the phrase.
The wisdom
of the moccasins, standing in someone else's shoes and being able to do that. Yeah. And of course, science itself, when considered closed, is not really science, is it?
Well, it's not. I mean, science is an ongoing thing. Science never stops.
Science never stops.
If science stopped, then we'd still be believing very old concepts about the world and the way we interact with it. But science is always ongoing, and that reflects our constant learning and expansion process.
So we're going to look a little bit, a bit of a sketch of the response to this particular issue through the different layers of consciousness. Yeah. So you want to let's start with a couple of those before we take a bit of a break.
Sure. I think the first thing we might mention is just the fact that as we grow through different layers of consciousness, each layer brings its own perspective on the world. It brings an underlying subconscious framework for making sense of reality. So it's not like a decision that we make to shift from one layer to the next. It's an evolutionary dynamic, a developmental dynamic at an individual level, where the most fundamental structures within our consciousness for making sense of our interaction with reality shift and change. And they might, for example, take us from believing that the world is a jungle and you've got to fight to survive, which is typical of layer 3, to layer 4, where the world is a place where we can only get what we need and do what we need to do by following someone else's rules, a higher authority's rules, right? And layer 4, that transition from layer 3 to layer 4 gave rise to the major religions, for example, which gave us a set of rules to follow to live life in the right way. And then the shift to layer 5, the modern scientific industrial perspective, changed that underlying framework again, where suddenly we started to believe that we could make the rules and we can make these discoveries that previously we thought we could only find out about from a higher authority, be it God or a king or whoever, right? And now we're shifting out of that modern scientific industrial perspective where we thought we could gather all the knowledge that we needed. We thought that we could make our own rules. And those ways of interacting with reality and living life are starting to break down because of the increasing complexity. Again, and that is the driver. It's always the driver for change is increasing complexity in our environment, our life conditions.
And of course, when we speak about these layers, which comes from Claire W. Graves' work that we refer to all the time on this show, none of these layers are intrinsically right or wrong.
No, each one reflects a human adaptation to a certain set of life conditions, and particularly the complexity of those life conditions.
Yeah.
And the more complex life becomes, the more expansive our perspective needs to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For all of you out there, strangers in a strange land, you're grokking FutureSense here on Bay FM. You're tuned to Bay FM 999 here on FutureSense with Steve McDonald and myself, Nyck Jeanes. And we're going to be talking about a bunch of stuff today. We're going to come to talking about climate change in particular, but interesting stories that pop up because we just mentioned before then, Steve, you were talking about how we interpret, how we receive our information that we try and make sense of the world by.
Yeah, these underlying frameworks, and they're by definition not something that we can be conscious of because they sit in our subconscious, but they're ways that we put our sensory input together to help us make sense of reality. And as we move, developing as individuals through these different layers or evolving as a species over the long term through these different layers, then our way of interacting with reality changes, and the things that we look for, the pieces of the puzzle that we try and gather to put a picture together change. And I mentioned before that in layer 4 we tend to always look for a higher authority, and we've come out of layer 3, which is a fully wild way of living where we're just living on our senses and instincts and emotions, and we're very much in the moment. We just do what we need to do in the moment. We don't think about cause and effect and that kind of thing. And that, of course, works for a certain amount of time, like all of these different layers of consciousness do, but over time it creates problems because we're basically living wild and disorganized. And so the evolutionary tension that arises brings us to look for structure, and we swing from the individual side of the evolutionary spiral back to the communal side, and we're looking for a set of rules. Okay, if that way of life is not working for me, I need to look for something more structured and something I can hang on to, a set of rules and those sorts of things. And often that
here comes Moses down from the mount with his 10 tablets.
He's got some pieces of stone with some rules. Thank God, literally. Anyway, there was an interesting article in the media this week that is a great example of that particular way of making sense of the world, and it's a report on a website called Breaking Israel News, and this has just happened to pop up under our nose this week, this news article, and we're not particularly focusing on any particular religion here, but the report is: a plague of locusts attacks Islam's holiest mosque in Mecca.
Yes.
And it has some wonderful photos of locusts all over the square there.
The praying imam or whoever
some
it is.
Poor chap in a white robe with locusts all over his robe.
I thought it was sort of fashion for a minute, but no. It's
but here's a wonderful example of looking to a higher authority for signs of things to come.
Yeah.
Rather than, for example, at the subsequent layer 5, we'd be looking to find out for ourselves, by gathering pieces of data. But here we are in this article here, interpreting a plague of locusts.
One of the 5 final plagues, according to the Torah.
Yeah.
Boils, fiery hail, locusts, darkness, and death of firstborn males. Sounds horrendous.
Yeah.
But this is actually, the fact is that many people on this planet, one way or the other, believe in these kind of
a surprisingly large number of people actually, more than you might think, are still living life according to the layer 4 principles. And it's a very interesting website. It actually has a menu item called End of Days. You can go there and read about all the recent reports of what's happening in the world, which are presented as evidence that the end of days are here.
The religious eschaton of one type or another.
Yeah. For a lot of people, this particular way works well because their life conditions are such that it solves the problems they need to solve.
And no doubt for some of those people, and this is not a criticism of those people, because as we've been saying, at the layer of consciousness that they are responding to these realities, this is how they see things. So many of these same people are likely to, for example, see climate change as a sign, perhaps.
Quite possibly. And it's important to remember too that many of us listening to this show, and of course you and I have grown through this stage. I don't know if you can remember a time in your life where you grabbed hold of a set of rules to follow and whose rules they were.
Somewhat, for sure. Well, probably at school early, because I think I broke out of that fairly early overall.
Right.
But of course, there's always a tendency to fall back to a sort of, let's put it, to a sort of tribal set of ways to be, or ways you look, ways you speak, ways you act, and so forth. Yeah, so sure.
Yeah, and this.
Well, you were in the military, so you definitely.
Well, I was. That was mine. That was my layer 4 experience.
Right.
Was joining the military and living according to that military code. Right?
I think it was my college that I went to in Adelaide, the boys' college. That was a fairly strict structure, and a loosely religious college.
And layer 4 being on the communal side of the spiral. Each of the communal layers has a code that you have to conform to, and at the tribal layer 2, it's the customs of the tribe. At layer 4, it's the authoritative instructions on how to live, and then at layer 6, which is our emerging layer globally at the moment, it's the agreed way of being according to our peer group that we're networked into.
Which is a really lovely thing, that we are coming together with the notion that we're seeking to bring our responses to the challenges of the planet at this time in group, in tribe, in community, trying to sit down in a communal way and fashion responses to it, rather than be sort of stuck in a more lonely individual place, perhaps.
That's
However,
right.
It's also fraught with its own challenges too.
Well, as is every layer. Every layer has its blind spots to some extent.
Blind spots.
And limitations. And through the benefit of research like the work of Claire Graves, we can look at these different layers, many of them anyway, and understand what those limitations might be, which is a very beneficial thing. And as we were saying before, when applied to the issue of climate science, we can see that the layer 6 perspective, which is extremely humanistic and anthropocentric, it does flavour the way that we do science and the way that we communicate science.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot to say here. You brought up an interesting phrase yesterday. Well, came up actually in my reality, the notion of the fear of extinction. There's a lot of species on the planet which are extinct or on endangered lists or in likelihood of extinction. But at the same time, this fear itself is a very strong driver, isn't it? And the fear of extinction is very understandable at the moment. The Earth is in trouble, it's in chaos.
So in the first 6 layers of consciousness, which is referred to as the first tier of human consciousness, fear is a consistent driver all the way through, and the fears change according to the layer, of course.
Yeah.
And it's very expectable. It's very predictable that layer 6, with its focus, which is turning to a reconnection to nature and taking notice of how we've been treating nature and the planet, that it's going to look at that and see all of the damage and the impact that we've had during the scientific industrial era, and then become fearful about the future. And, how are we going to repair this? How are we going to survive as a species potentially? And that is an acknowledged fear that arises during layer 6, is the fear that we may not survive as a species.
Yeah. We'd like to encourage you, however, just as an aside here, to look at the extinction of fear rather than the fear of extinction. But that's just a little bit of an aside, because it's perfectly natural that we have these fears, as you're saying, because they are a driver, aren't they, for change? How does that work? What's that look like in layer 6 in particular?
It's something that creates evolutionary tension. So, we talk a lot about the slingshot effect that takes place during the transition from one layer to the next layer. So whenever we go through a major change, and in fact, whenever any complex adaptive system goes through a phase transition, that is a major change, then you will see this slingshot effect play out. And that involves the gradual increase of evolutionary tension, and that means tension between where things need to be in order for there to be a balance and adequate coping of the system, and where things are at the moment. And the larger the gap between those things gets, the more tension there is for change, right? And so you can sort of use the analogy of pulling back the elastic band on a slingshot, and the further the elastic band stretches away from the slingshot, the more tension there
More
is,
tension.
but also the more potential there is for movement.
As an old teacher of mine used to say, tension seeks resolution.
Exactly.
It's inevitable.
Exactly, it does. So just take that example that you gave, this fear of extinction. The more that we fear that we might not survive, then the more tension is created to drive action to resolve, whatever it is that we see as a source.
So the fear is not a bad thing, and yet it also can be crippling too, in a way, because you can possibly, in my view, you could potentially ignore or not see some other information that may be contributing to a broader, deeper, expanding perception of what's going on.
Yeah, fear is an essential evolutionary signaling process.
Yes.
Nothing about human nature is essentially bad. Everything has a purpose. It's just that we take different perspectives and we look at things from different perspectives, and then we maybe they look bad to us because of who we are and where we're looking from. But fear is there for a reason. I mean, I don't think evolution ever makes mistakes, although not everybody agrees with that.
No. As we said, we had a couple of communications, and thank you to those two people who communicated with us this week about this issue of our take on or sharing of different perspectives on the climate change debate. But one of the interesting things about one of those communications was there was and I almost hesitate to say it, but a sort of casual accusation that we were sort of in the pocket of the coal industry or the fossil fuel industry somehow, because we dared to mention the potential or the possibility in this complex system that we've been talking about, that perhaps we're moving actually towards a mini ice age, or certainly to elements of cooling. Let's look at some of the science regarding particular issues. I think you want to mention something to do with the oceans in particular.
Yeah, two articles taking quite different perspectives on ocean temperature popped up this week. The first one, the headline is "Ocean warming is accelerating faster than thought, new research finds." And it's talking about sea surface temperature measurements. And indeed, the data, so it reports in the article, is showing that sea surface temperature is rising. Although there are lots of different angles and perspectives on how sea surface temperature has been measured over time and whether it's really an accurate measure, but that's another discussion. And then the second article says researchers find bottom of Pacific getting colder, possibly due to Little Ice Age, and they're referring to the last Little Ice Age there. And I think these two articles are a wonderful example of partial perspectives on a very large system. And when we're dealing with a system as large as the planet's climate, there's a lot to consider. Okay, and really more than any one climate scientist historically has been able to study. And so this is why it's important for us to take a step backwards and look at all of the information available to us and start to integrate it all and create a more complex picture of the climate and get a deeper understanding of all the different factors that are taking place. And so the second article, this one about the bottom of the Pacific getting colder, is talking about a very long-term cycle which involves water circulating from the top of the ocean and down to the bottom of the oceans, and temperatures changing. And it's basically explaining that there's a very long-term cycle where warming precedes cooling, which precedes warming, and so we're swapping between warming and cooling and warming and cooling. It aligns with the ocean warming article because the ocean warming article says the top of the ocean's warm, and that's true. But the ocean warming article doesn't take into account the fact that the bottom of the ocean is cold.
In terms of just quickly, just as a bigger picture from your particular perspective, right now with this particular debate, how or where we should be looking at for a broader perspective, if those out there are willing to do so, to look at it from this bigger picture. Because as we said before, we're not talking here at all about supporting old industries to continue. We're actually looking at what's actually the longer term change, the longer term shift in this and in everything on this planet at this time.
Yeah, I think that's a really good angle. And it's very, very important for us to understand what's happening with the climate, because whether you believe in global warming or global cooling, it's looking like we're in for a big change, right? And we really need to be ready for whatever that change is going to be.
Yeah.
And some people are predicting that the cold weather could cause major crop losses as early as 2024, which could have a massive impact on humanity. And of course, people who are looking at the global warming angle and believing that are also predicting major changes which will impact us. So it's really important for us to sort this out. And one of the things that is taking place at the moment is that potentially quite different topics are being conflated into one discussion.
Yes.
And as you indicated before, they are things like the burning of fossil fuels and the fossil fuel industry is being lumped into the same bag as climate change. And therefore, one of our listeners who wrote into the Byron Shea Echo thought that because we were talking about global cooling, that we were automatically pro fossil fuel use.
And even possibly, I'm sorry to say this, but you did suggest this if you are listening, that we may actually be somehow on the take of the fossil fuel industry.
Actually lobbying for the fossil fuel industry, which is simply not true. So it's important to be able to pick apart these differences and just discern that, okay, well, they're actually two different topics. And we are absolutely pro clean energy production and a shift from dirty energy to clean renewable energy.
Absolutely.
There's no doubt about that. So that's one thing, is just to start to be a little bit more discerning about what's being discussed and not fall into the groupthink of, or everybody's saying this, so I'm going to say this as well. But that's one of the tricky things about this transition from layer 5, the modern scientific industrial perspective, to layer 6, which is this humanistic network-centric perspective, is that when we're transitioning into layer 6, our peer network becomes very important to us. And our personal angle on that is we want to be accepted and acknowledged and included in that peer group. And that's a very, very strong driver. And the ultimate driver within that, even the C of it, is this need for deep human connection.
Yeah.
Okay, and that becomes a major, major influence. And so there is considerable pressure for us to come to agreement with whatever the peer group is believing at the time. And so that is one dynamic at play at the moment that may be moving some people to fall in line with whatever seems to be the agreed angle on climate change.
And with very good intention, I would hope too, because we are all deeply concerned about the state of the planet, of course. And clearly we're on the verge of something. I think most people can feel it in one way or the other inside themselves. I'd certainly suggest that you look at yourself, and from my perspective anyway, as one person, to really look at how that manifests in you, your own personal perspective regards to your own inner journey, but also what's actually happening politically, what's actually happening environmentally, socially, all of these issues. And at the same time, of course, it's, as you said, this need for layer 6 to come together, to meet like minds and like souls, like beings, and to sit in circle, to do ceremony perhaps, to share, to work on the self and try and bring yourself into a better alignment with things. All of these things are very positive and wonderful expressions at this time for many people as we move into this area. But it doesn't necessarily mean that someone else over there is wrong. They're just different.
Different perspectives.
Another
facet of this shift into layer 6 is that it's normal and natural for us to strongly reject the old paradigm.
Yeah.
And you can look back through history and see that every time we've made this a major shift to a new paradigm, we've strongly rejected the old way, whatever it has been, And so there's a tendency to throw the baby out with the bathwater there. We've come through a very materialistic, clinical scientific era where many of the aspects of human nature have been rejected. For example, our emotional experience, our body's subtle energy fields, all of those sorts of things which can't be measured by a dial in a laboratory necessarily, have been minimised and even outright rejected.
For the last few hundred years, certainly since the Industrial Revolution and layer 5's
that's right, and
dominance.
As we grow into a more sensitive experience of being human in layer 6, which has an expanded set of perceptions, then it's just natural that we look back at that old era and say we don't want to be like that anymore. But we just have to be careful that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because what's happening with science is that we're moving away from hard scientific data, and we're moving towards whatever our peer group agrees on, right? And that's often expressed in the 97% of scientists agree that this is happening. And so with the benefit of the research that we're always talking about, we can actually see our own blind spots if we take the time to look.
Yeah, beautiful. You're tuned to FutureSense. That's Steve McDonald and myself, Nyck Jeanes, here. And just to reiterate a couple of things. First of all, you can text in at any time, 0437 341 119. 0437 341 119 comes up on the screen here. Anything you'd like to contribute to or ask in this discussion. And as I said earlier on too, you can follow us on Twitter at FutureSense Show. And also, we are a free podcast available on Apple Podcasts and on Spotify.
You're resonating right now on FutureSense with Steve McDonald and Nyck Jeanes.
We are talking about many things today, but particularly focused on climate change, the climate change debate, if you will. And we've been talking a lot about the qualities of the different layers with regard to this, and in terms of in layer 5 and the nature of the competitive consumerist capitalist structures in which we've been living for quite a long time, the notion of reducing things, of compartmentalizing, of taking them apart, as you referred to earlier, Steve, in order to understand them, as being the sort of the science mode largely of that era, and with great success. It's done some amazing things and continues to do so.
It's been a general approach, a general perspective in the modern scientific industrial era, and it applies not just to science but to every discipline. If you look, we've gone very, very deep in very narrow areas of study.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what discipline you look at, certainly science is included. And that has provided very, very deep specialization, which is wonderful, and it's added to the continuing accumulation of human capacity, that we've gone deep and specialized in these areas. If we hadn't done that, then we wouldn't have the knowledge that we have today, which has produced a lot of the technology which has actually connected us together, which is driving the evolutionary tension to shift to higher on the evolutionary spiral. And so this separation of things, the isolation of things, the specialization and the reductionist thinking has been a key aspect of the modern scientific way of being human, scientific industrial way.
And at the same time, as we move into layer 6, a different kind of science, as you've been alluding to, is on the table, is available to us, a more comprehensive and all-inclusive science. And perhaps one of the issues with the climate science debate is that it does not sometimes include all the pieces that may be relevant. Because some of those pieces may sit outside the climate science discipline itself. And we're going to talk about a couple of those pieces now that may have an influence on the way that climate is changing. And one of those came across this week, the fact that, and this is a scientific truth at the moment, truth is that Earth's magnetic pole is on the move, and fast. Now this happens quite a lot, we'll talk about that. But the Earth's magnetic field, as you would know, is what actually allows us to exist on the planet at all. It deflects harmful radiation. It keeps our water and atmosphere in place. But it is acting up. According to science journal Nature, something strange is going on deep down below, and it is causing the magnetic North Pole to skitter. That's the word they use. I love the word. To skitter away from Canada towards Siberia. The magnetic pole is moving so quickly that it has forced the world's geomagnetism experts into a rare move, and that is that on January the 30th, coming up shortly, in fact it's been delayed due to the US government shutdown, g'day Donald, the World Magnetic Model, which governs modern navigation systems, is due to undergo an urgent update to accommodate this shift. The model is a vital component of systems ranging from geopositioning systems used to navigate ships through to smartphone trackers and maps. And the current model is expected to be valid until 2020, but the magnetic pole began to shift so quickly it was realized that in 2018 that the model had to be fixed now. So they realized it was so inaccurate that it was about to exceed the acceptable safe limits for navigational errors. So how does that factor in? And you're also going to talk about geothermal science as well there.
Yeah, lots is changing at the moment. And as you said, traditionally climate scientists don't look at a lot of these things. They have a particular area of interest which is measuring temperatures and precipitation and cycles, weather cycles and those sorts of things, and they don't tend to look at issues of astrophysics or geothermal activity.
Yeah.
And all of these things are creating a very, very complex picture of change, and I'd suggest that they're all related in some way. They're all part of a shift that's going on globally, and all also connected in some way to the shifts in human consciousness, although we haven't got the science to really explain their connections yet.
Yeah.
But, I'm starting to pick up possibilities like, for example, the higher incidence of cosmic radiation impacting the planet at the moment is being measured by people flying in airline aircraft up at high altitudes, 30,000 feet and 40,000 feet.
Yes.
And I've seen experiments where they take up little test tubes full of water and they're holding them up, and you can actually see the cosmic rays going through the water because they leave a trail of bubbles when they impact.
Sexy.
And so I can't help but think about our heads, right? When we're sitting up there in the plane, and the cosmic rays that might be penetrating our scon and leaving bubbles in our brain. Or
SCOD if you're British.
That's right. Those sorts of things. I mean, it's unlikely that there's no impact on human consciousness from these things. And same thing with magnetic fields. Like, we know that we can shift human consciousness using magnetic fields. There are experiments.
There are. In fact, I had a piece, it's not in front of me now, about some of the new technology regarding using magnetic fields to minimise depression in people, for example. There's a piece I think I sent to you.
So all of these things are impacting us, and they're quite likely impacting different people in different places on the planet in different ways. I've often thought, over the years that I've been pondering human nature, I've often thought about why certain places on the planet are hotspots for violence, for example, like the Middle East, right? And yet why are other places, like here in Australia, thankfully, generally very, very peaceful by comparison? And inevitably there'll be some issue of life conditions, which is
the main driver,
a factor in these differences, and it could be to do with radiation, it could be to do with magnetic anomalies. The science on those sorts of things is really yet to be done.
Similarly on things like 5G, we won't get into that debate now, but I'm certainly a bit suspicious of 5G for these very reasons. I don't think the science has really been done about the potential human effect there.
No, it hasn't, and it can't really be done until they roll it out. And it's existing.
Paradox.
I mean, it's another limitation of science where you can do an isolated experiment in a laboratory, but until you actually look at the entire system and the way that all the elements of the system are going to respond to this change that's being introduced, you can't actually know exactly what's going to happen. So in putting together a somewhat different and alternative picture of the climate trend at the moment, I've been looking well outside the traditional climate change boundaries at astrophysics, at all of these other measurements that are being done on magnetic fields and geothermal changes,
cosmic radiation, sun activity.
And it's putting a picture together which is pointing towards something different than the mainstream story.
Tell us about the geothermal activity, because that's rather interesting, underneath the Arctic and the Antarctic.
Yeah, sure. So I've got a couple of articles here which I will dig out. One of them is looking at basically the movement of magma, liquid rock, which is actually happening reasonably close to the surface of the Earth, both in the Arctic and the Antarctic.
Also beneath North America, the fast-flowing Molten River is weakening the magnetic influence of the iron core beneath North America, according to this article that I was talking about, the magnetic field. Yeah,
right. And the articles that I've been looking at are suggesting that this movement of very, very hot liquid rock fairly close under the Earth's crust is at least in part impacting
the magnetic,
the melting of ice at the poles at the moment. So that that again, that's another factor that most climate scientists wouldn't even be looking at, and so assumptions are being made about global greenhouse gases and CO2 and those sorts of things causing these changes, when in fact it's probably not the full story.
Yeah, it is true that the movement of the Earth's magnetic field has been actually doing weird stuff apparently for some 1,000 years. And again, these long cycles, these long time spans. Perhaps we're in an era now. This might be riffing a bit here. We're in an era of taking in those longer cycles more readily. We're looking at those longer cycles as actually having an influence rather than a very short time span that we've done for quite a long time. I would argue certainly the last few hundred years at least.
And that dynamic was identified in Claire Graves' research.
Yeah.
He found that when we're in communally oriented layers of consciousness,
you start to take a longer view.
We always take a longer view, and you can look back at traditional tribal people who have stories which have been told orally for tens of thousands of years, and which sometimes can be verified by science. And then in the sort of biblical authoritarian agricultural layer 4 era, again, we were talking about long-term cycles, and we were talking, about biblical stories which supposedly took place 2,000 years ago or more, as being relevant and useful. And here we are again, moving out of the individually oriented, short-term thinking, scientific, industrial era into the relativistic, humanistic oriented layer 6, where again we're turning to long-term perspectives.
And with that also, we may get to talk about this in a bit more fully as the rest of the show goes on, that change from competition to cooperation is another aspect of that.
And again, that's a natural dynamic that we find in the individual versus communal layers of consciousness.
Thanks very much for your texts. Thanks for your lovely words, some of you, and some other points here which are a little hard to take on. We might take a couple of these others as we go forward.
You're tuned to FutureSense with Nyck Jeanes and Steve McDonald. Engage, emerge, activate, and spiral up.
You are tuned to BFM 999, and we have breaking news. If you happen to be going to Melbourne today, what's going on down there? If you're flying into Melbourne, watch out.
We've just got a tweet hot off the press from Ross Hill in Melbourne, who said
Ross.
Inbound flights to Melbourne Airport are currently holding or diverting, and according to local media reports, the reason is a fire alarm going off at the control tower.
It's that hot down there, that's for sure. And we were talking about the cooling of Europe recently. I mentioned the number of effects going on in really across the whole of the continent of Europe at the moment. Some of the coldest temperatures ever seen, snowbound, avalanches, people were unfortunately being killed, and some pretty dire situations there. Same thing has been in North America at different times. And you've looking also at ocean currents and the movement of ocean currents as another factor in this very complex equation, in this very complex adaptive system in which we are of global climate.
Yeah, so we're just trawling through a raft of different issues, which
using
are
a fishing ocean analogy, we're trawling,
all coming together. And one of them is what's called the global ocean conveyor, or the Atlantic conveyor, which is a current of seawater, which takes warm water from the tropics, and we're talking about the surface of the ocean here, not the bottom of the ocean, and moves it up into the northern hemisphere there. And one of the things that's going on at the moment is that, as we know and is often reported, a lot of Arctic sea ice has been melting, and this puts fresh water from the melting ice into the ocean.
So the warm, salty water in this conveyor moves up to the northern hemisphere. It assists, so to speak, in melting the ice, which is fresh water. That cooler, much colder fresh water comes into the ocean.
Yeah, and not just the warm ocean water, but also the warm air temperature,
of course, carries
which
with it.
of course is influenced by the warm ocean. And so we're getting this less dense fresh water dumped into the ocean, and what normally happens is when this circulation is just operating business as usual, then as the water cools, the salt water cools, it sinks down to the bottom of the ocean and then goes down to that area that one probably, we're talking about the Atlantic here, but the previous story we mentioned was about the cold water at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, so there's probably a similar kind of thing happening there also. And it all sort of goes merrily on its way, but what we've got happening at the moment is a whole bunch of cold, fresh water getting dumped into the ocean, which means that the less dense water is less likely to sink, and so it is. They are measuring the speed of this global ocean conveyor, and they're saying that it's slowing down at the moment, and they're putting it down to the fact that this fresh water is getting dumped in there. So I'm reading an article here from UCAR, Centre for Science and Education. So it's a university website, and it's saying paradoxically this ocean circulation interference caused by global warming could lead to a cooling in Western Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And they're saying that if the global ocean conveyor were to stop completely, the average temperature of Northern Europe would cool 5 to 10 degrees Celsius, which is an awful lot more than the global warming increase that everyone is worried about in terms of temperature change. But even a slow down and not a complete stop could lead to a measurable cooling. And it may well be, we don't know, we're just speculating here, but it may well be that the cold weather we're seeing in the short term at the moment in Europe might be associated with
early signs of that.
The ocean conveyor. But again, here's yet another angle coming from different science that's suggesting to us that, okay, things are going on here which could make it cooler for us all.
And all of this information, folks, if you're interested and you're contesting or you're disturbed by or you don't like some of the things we don't agree with, fine, that's absolutely fine, of course, but do the research. It certainly happened for me, always happening for me in this particular space of looking deeper into these issues. We've also got some information which we haven't confirmed to that the fifth assessment of the International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, neglected the natural climate change potential or the issue of natural climate change, or how does that work, as a factor in its fifth assessment. We don't know if that's true or not. I've been trying to look it up, but it's a bit hard to find evidence of that one way or the other right now.
Yeah, this is fresh information. I've been corresponding with someone on Twitter who goes by the name Grand Solar Minimum, and I'm pretty sure that this chap is behind the website grandsolarminimum.com. So if you haven't heard that term before, Grand Solar Minimum, it's talking about a particular aspect of the solar cycle which is going to take us to an unusually low level of activity on the sun, and that's due to happen around about 2050 or 2052 in that region there, I understand. So we've got a couple of solar cycles to play out before then. We're actually
in a solar minimum at the moment.
In a solar minimum here, in 2019, and these cycles run roughly about 11 years. So there's a couple of cycles to play out until we get to grand solar minimum. But what certain measures are showing, and one of those measures is the Thermosphere Climate Index, which is a relatively new measure that NASA have in place, which involves satellites measuring the top of the atmosphere and temperature change up there, and it's showing a steady decrease in the upper atmosphere temperature, which is creating a trend towards some kind of temperature minimum in the future.
That's where the Schumann resonance also emanates from the thermosphere, I believe, and the differential from the top and the lower layers of the thermosphere create the Schumann resonance.
Yeah, it's interesting because there have been some shifts in the Schumann resonance over the last year or two also.
Yes.
The frequency is shifting. So on this website, grandsolarminimum.com, he has a report which relates to the IPCC climate change announcement made in 2013, saying that the IPCC agreed that 98% of climate change drivers are being attributed to human contribution. And as a result of that decision that they made, factors involved in natural climate change are not included in the IPCC's theory and forecasts. So this means that they are disregarding changes in solar activity, including electromagnetism and magnetism, geomagnetism, cosmic ray impact and low clouds, volcanic aerosols, cloud formation at varying altitudes and latitudes, climate and ocean circulation systems, water vapor and carbon dioxide consequent to global warming, and instead focusing simply on the assumed CO2 issue being caused by human activity. So that is very alarming, and this information has literally only come to me during this radio show today, so I can't unfortunately confirm,
verify or
deny.
And again, it's up to you out there, you listeners, to determine what is true for you, what works for you, and what evidence you can see that brings a broader perspective. I guess that's the key to today's show, is with regards to every issue and the future. where we're going on this planet and the many challenges that we do face here, the broader perspective that we take really should be, in my view, the best option in order to take in as much information and to get the most intelligent response to things that are going on.
Yeah, and I also just want to add as well that when we mention websites on the show, we don't imply that we endorse everything on a particular website. We don't have the time to go through and read everything on a website. Sometimes we find something that's interesting and worth mentioning on the show, and we'll give out the website address, but please don't assume that we fully endorse and are getting paid by the owners of those websites, because sometimes
wish we were.
We had
one of our I wish we were paid by them. Yeah,
one of our recent complaints was inferring that.
Yeah, that's right. And again, it's about empowerment. We, in some sense or other, I'm just jumping to a broader perspective here, we do need to encourage ourselves and each other to empower ourselves with our own research, our own intelligent and intuitive take on the way things are evolving and developing here on the planet. Things are moving fast. It's paradoxical. There's a lot of paradox. Hard to hold two things at once in the palm of your hand, but sometimes it's good practice, in my view. It's sort of what's worked for me a lot. It's just to be able to hold contesting points of view rather than rage against one and claim the other as the ultimate truth. That seems to be the dangerous place that we've fallen into on this planet in one way or the other for a very long time.
And part of the good news is that at the moment there's more than one consciousness shift going on. So we often talk about this shift from the modern scientific industrial to the humanistic, decentralized, network-centric kind of worldview, but that's not the only story. It's simply the dominant global paradigm is making that particular shift. But there are people who are still living life according to most of the other layers on the whole spiral of human consciousness, and who are also going through their own shifts from one layer to the next. And there are also some of those people who are ahead of the pack. So there are people who have already made this massive leap in consciousness from layer 6 to layer 7, and some even further beyond that, which means that there are certain people on the planet who are taking an integrative perspective on these issues and are trying to move beyond the blind spots that we have, particularly in these first 6 layers of consciousness in the first tier. And we're doing our best to do this on this show, FutureSense, to take an integrative approach where we look at all of the data that we have and we try and piece together all of these things, often in non-traditional ways that are going beyond the sort of standard practices of the scientific industrial era, to get a more complete picture and form a more integrated and complex understanding of what the hell is going on out there.
Very good. One of those movements that we've been talking about, and we mentioned it earlier today, is the movement from the competitive era, the competition that we've seen dominate the planet for the last few hundred years at least, in the 5th layer in particular, and cooperation, which is an emergent quality that's certainly growing amongst many of us now. This instinct to actually work together, to come together, and as Steve said earlier, to actually join together with your tribe, with your peer group, and to find a connection there. And that movement from competition or cooperation is really something that's even now in ABC News. Well, not even now, ABC is fantastic, but a couple of days ago, a piece on this exact thing, which human instinct is stronger, competition or cooperation. And a number of researchers have looked at this and concluded, not categorically, but pretty much that competition actually is more of an inherent quality than competition. Now, of course, as Steve would probably say, that's depending on which layer of consciousness you're operating from.
Yeah, and this is typical of a first-tier approach to studying human nature. Is there's an underlying assumption that human nature is a fixed thing, and we just have to discover what it is. But in fact, human nature is multifaceted, and depending on which layer of consciousness a person is living life from, then human nature looks different, and it can be either competitive or collaborative, depending on which layer people are at. And of course, the communally oriented layers, which are the odd-numbered layers like tribal and authoritarian and relativistic, the 6th layer, are collaborative.
Yes, well, as this article says, there's quite a lot here, and you might like to have a look at this. It's by Fiona Pepper from ABC News on Wednesday the 9th of this month, a week or so ago, less than a week ago. But one of the conclusions of this, I think, is really important, is that to let the sharing instinct, the cooperative instinct emerge, we have to trust that we're in a supportive environment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's your supportive network from layer 6.
Mm.
So she's very effectively tapped into this emerging layer of human consciousness and testing the waters there and describing quite accurately what is going on.
I mean, an earlier article from last year, middle of June, also from the ABC, talking about how we're on the other hand, from ideas to borders, we're becoming scared to share, and there's a lot at stake. And I think this is also interesting too. That on one hand, there's an issue with overconsumption, overconnection, and then there's also a global crisis of loneliness. Like in one sense, we're more connected. And yet, on the other hand, it's arguable that we're lonelier and we're actually scared to meet each other. And there's a lot of these. I think there's another piece which is a bit too complex to look at today. That again, I think our good friend Ross Hill sent us the other day about how we approach the expression of. Actually, I'm not very clear on this. I'll come back to that in a minute.
Sure.
Yeah. So this idea of being scared to share, of not being able to connect with each other, and yet clearly we're in a very connected world. It's an interesting paradox in itself.
My first guess would be that's probably somebody who's looking at the world from layer 6 and looking at a world which is quite markedly still in layer 5 in many respects, and seeing those layer 5 attributes, which are all about actually holding information in rather than sharing it, because the holding in and ownership of information created power during that scientific industrial era. Yeah. The more information you had, and which you had solely, meant that you had an advantage over other people in a competitive sense. Yeah. And so there's a perspective on the old paradigm from the new paradigm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which happens all the time.
It does.
I've lost that particular piece. You have to forgive me. Yeah, maybe I didn't have enough coffee this morning.
Sometimes the complexity overwhelms us here in the studio, folks.
And it does. It does. I think I'm enjoying. I don't know. I mean, how are you responding out there to complexity in your life? Do you feel it's complex? Perhaps you don't. Perhaps you feel that life is very simple and easy. Good on you. Give us your secrets. Text in 0437 341 119. If you find that life is really simple and easy, give us your keys and your give the keys to your domain. Or is it complex? And if so, how so? It's rather an important part.
For all of you out there, strangers in a strange land, you're grokking FutureSense here on Bay FM.
10:49 here on FutureSense with myself, Nick, and Steve over there. And I hope you've enjoyed the show. We've got so much stuff to share with you. We run out of time so quickly. It's quite amazing. I did want to just very quickly add, and it's relevant to what we're talking about. Many of you know or knew Danny Schreiber, who said, one of the many things he said, when we step into the role of planetary custodian and through our harmonic choices and shared vision, we curate the living art of the earth, we fulfill our destiny and become an earth imagineer. And a website of Danny's work, of Dan Schreiber's work, is now up and available if you are interested. It's called earthimagineers.org, earthimagineers.org. And Danny, we both knew quite well, quite an extraordinary being in his own right, that's for sure. And God bless him wherever he is right now. Conclusion for today, we've touched on so many things, and yet there's so many other things to add to this debate, and it's an ongoing thing, which is why we're here every week.
Today's conclusion is that the climate is changing and human consciousness is changing.
Beautiful. And as we said before, you can tune in on us, with us, to us, for us, through us, on Twitter at FutureSense Show, and FutureSense Podcast is available free on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And also, we have a website now, absolutely brand new, and thanks again to Ross Hill. It's futuresense.it, futuresense.it. And as this year goes forward in this expanding and fast-changing world that we live in, we will be expanding our availability of the information that we're presenting to, should it be useful to you. And I'm sure that if you're listening, it hopefully is. Haven't answered a couple of these texts here, but I think we'll leave them for now. They're well taken, and because they sort of take us a little bit to a bit off topic and we don't have the time. But thanks very much for your engagement, those of you who have communicated with us today. You're down, we mentioned it last week, you're down at a conference this week down in Coffs Harbour.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Doing a couple of talks down there, one talk and a workshop down there together with my colleague Dr. Stephen Booth, who's coming up from Melbourne.
Yes.
Looking forward to that.
And that's Illuminate, it's called?
Illuminate is the conference. Yeah, it's run by the folks who previously put together a conference about extraterrestrial life and the human afterlife, and they've combined both of those topics and put together this conference, Illuminate, which is, they're calling it a conference about consciousness in general.
Yeah. Aspect of Consciousness Symposium, it is called. You can go to it on Facebook. There is a website too. But Illuminate Aspects of Consciousness Symposium, it's from this Thursday through till Saturday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, at Breakthrough Anuka Beach Resort. You're going to be having a lovely time down there.
I'm planning on having a lovely time.
Sounds great. I should come down, but I don't think I can. Maybe I can drop down for a day. You never know. Might arrive on the spur and the spirit of the moment. I think that's it for today. Anything else we can...
I think that's it. There's always lots more, but maybe we'll save it till next week.
We will. We'll tune in next week. Thanks. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to FutureSense, a podcast edited from the radio show of the same name, broadcast on Bay FM in Byron Bay, Australia, at bayfm.org. FutureSense is available on iTunes and SoundCloud. The future is here now. It's just not evenly distributed.